Thank you again, and on your behalf, let me welcome our panelists once more. Since this morning, we've had quite extensive discussions and presentations on ideas about what to do to make sure that we move from discussion to action, especially with regard to climate finance. So let me begin by asking host, President Ruto, what he should consider to be the key elements of global climate finance architecture that we should all be aiming at, especially when we get to UAE for COP28.
Thank you very much, Professor Orama. As I said this morning, how do we move from potential to opportunity? And how do we turn the opportunities we have into jobs, into investments, and into industrialization, manufacturing, and growth? That's really what we need to do. And front and center is the big elephant. Where is the money going to come from? How are we going to finance our transition from opportunity to growth? In my opinion, there are three areas that we need to focus. Number one, we need to focus on where do we find money or resources or financing, number one, at scale, and number two, that is affordable, and number three, that is accessible. And that is why we have insisted that while we appreciate the contribution of our multilateral development institutions, the current financial architecture to support our progress, what they are doing is good, but it is insufficient because our current challenges are compounded. We're not dealing with a normal situation. We're not dealing with the situation for which these institutions were built. And therefore, it is important for us to realign our sources of financing with the realities of the moment. The moment we need a scale-up of development resources. And that is why we are speaking about scale. At the moment, we need to make sure that these resources are available at rates that are friendly to the investments we want to make. And therefore, in my very honest opinion, the reform of the multilateral development banks will achieve two things. And when we talk about reform of multilateral development banks, some of those banks, whether it is IMF or World Bank, we are shareholders. So legitimately, these are our institutions. And therefore, we need to deal with how do we make these institutions of ours much more fit for purpose? How do we make them fit for purpose? So, number one, we think like we did with COVID, when there was some creativity and innovation that resulted in special drawing rights. We think that there is scope in that window of special drawing rights to meet the challenges that we have of the moment of energy transition. What we would want done differently this time is that the manner in which these resources are allocated should be different, where those who need it most get it, while those who need it least don't have to get a lion's share of what they don't need. That's number one. Number two, we believe also creatively and in an innovative manner, there is scope for us to use and leverage the balance sheets of these institutions. And I must do a disclaimer. I am not a financial person. I am a scientist. But I am very confident that we have very intelligent people. We are not short of good economists and analysts and financial people who can imagine that space and tell us what is it that we can do to leverage the balance sheets of these great institutions. And that is what my sister Motley is talking about, the Bridgetown Initiative. How do we raise an extra $500 billion every year, or at least in 5 years, to be able to do what we must do with energy transition? And finally, I think the other option that we need to have a conversation about is carbon tax. This is a very controversial thing, but it is the right thing to have the conversation about. However controversial it may be, I mean, we need to have a conversation about carbon tax. If we are to raise the scale of resources needed for energy transition, we must have a conversation about carbon tax. In fact, the numbers speak to it. The IMF has actually done a lot of work around it, and they have told us it is possible to raise 870 billion shillings from carbon tax. The only problem that IMF is pointing to us is that there is insufficient political will, and there are challenges with political will. Surely, faced with an existential threat to humanity, aren't we able to master the political will to achieve this? And let me give one more thought around it. The EU Parliament has already considered FTT, the financial transaction tax, as a means of raising resources to deal with climate change. And in fact, they've gone all the way to their parliament. So the idea of a carbon tax is no longer remote. We must have it firmly on the table. And finally, Professor, we are making these suggestions because we are practical. We are dealing with practical situations. As I said this morning, 9 countries have already gone off the cliff. Many are on the way there to debt distress because of high interest rates and because of climate change. Unless we deal with it, and let us not imagine that we are sorted, especially because when we were in Paris, admittedly, there were found ways of dealing with countries that have been already in default. But the question we ask ourselves, do we have to wait until countries have gone to default to sort them out? Isn't it possible for us to sort them out ahead of the cliff? And that is the conversation we are having. And let me conclude by saying that this time round, we're going to be firmly on the table. It doesn't matter how uncomfortable this conversation is. It doesn't matter who we annoy. We are going to be here until we are heard and until the right thing happens.